My name is David Deere. I'm a pharmaceutical consultant in the United States at Nashville, Tennessee. Welcome to CPHI China. I've been asked on behalf of the organizers of the conference to present to you China's pharmaceutical market, my understanding, my observation. I hope that you enjoy this. I'm going to be as informal as I can about it. China's pharmaceutical market, single greatest generational opportunity for global pharma. That is the question or the statement that I've made many times over the years and working in the pharmaceutical market and studying it and observing it in many capacities. And the question is that does that still apply today, given a lot of changes in the geopolitical environment that the Western and multinational pharmaceuticals are operating in. So first, let's take a look at the China premise as it has been in the past, and let's do a quick situation analysis. I think it goes without saying that the economic miracle that China has been able to accomplish over the last 40 years has been unprecedented in human history. In 40 years, the per capita GDP has increased by 40-fold. This had lifted over 500 million Chinese citizens out of what was internationally considered almost a poverty level, and China is well on its way to achieving its middle income status for its 1.4 billion population, and that is a goal that the government is pursuing with diligence. How is this accomplished? Well, China took advantage of its comparative advantage of a large population in low-cost manufacturing export. Multinational corporations around the world, in particular in the United States, outsourced low technology, low margin, more mature product lines to be manufactured in China at a lower price and then re-exported back to the West and on a global basis. This has been very lucrative for China, and it has also been very lucrative for the multinational corporations. There has been some blowback on that. I will not touch on that, but it is, I think, anyone who observes the current situation that we have between the West and China understands that there's been debate for a long time. What China does seek to do, as I had mentioned earlier, is they want to be a moderately prosperous country. To kind of do the translation version, that means middle income for its 1.4 billion. They have a hard target date that they would like to achieve in the future. They will accomplish this by adding higher value laden manufacturing. That means move up the value chain from lower technology, lower margin to higher margin products. In 2015, the government put forward an economic policy plan called Made in China 2025, where 10 high technology sectors were targeted for investment by the government, investment by industry, subsidizing, if you would have it, with the objective of substituting the high technology imports from the West in Chinese manufacturing, building up a scale whereby the cost will go down on it significantly, and then exporting to the West the products and really achieve, to a certain extent, a global export dominance in those sectors. Needless to say, this got the attention of the West. They cried mercantilism to a large extent. And this really is when the whole issue of the China premise, at least from the Western perspective, began to take focus. When China entered in 2001 the WTO most favored nation trading status with the United States at that time, the idea was China would move up the economic ladder, and ultimately, as witnessed in many other countries around the world, you would have a liberalization as the citizenry got more prosperous. That simply has not occurred, and that is somewhat alarming given the ideological differences that we have. This led in, of course, this occurred in 2015 when the 2025 Made in China was released. the United States was going through a presidential election at the time. We didn't pay attention to it, quite frankly speaking. But the next administration that came in January of 2017 began to aggressively pursue the whole trading situation with China and what really referred to as a U.S. trade war. I mean, it's formally that. That occurred in January of 2017. Tariffs were placed on a number of Chinese goods. It was ramped up and phased in over time, a variety of different tariffs, and China and the United States entered into a phase one agreement in January of 2020 with the objective of reducing some of those tariffs based upon economic metrics that were being achieved. Of course, we had the pandemic occur. China was unable to meet those metrics, and the phase one agreement did expire at the end of last year in December. Again, the global pandemic has altered trade worldwide and really has had a significant impact on global economies everywhere. China has entered into what they refer to as a wolf warrior diplomacy, and of course that is diplomats around the world being a bit more aggressive than they have been in the past. That has had a significant impact on the formal attitude of Western governments toward China. And I think really what the biggest concern that, at least in the West, is that China seems to be challenging the West in terms of the post-World War II economic order, which is kind of a liberal free market economy order with Western-style democracy, which does not appear to be the case, certainly after the 2022 National People's Congress. So it's not a real good environment right now for proposing that statement, is China remains the single greatest generational opportunity. So I'd like to explain why my rationale behind that. First, we have to look at the strategic drivers of global pharma sector. The global pharma industry, and that really, if you look at the top 25 companies, they are R&D based industry, and they have been a victim of their own success. I refer to it as the blessings of the low-hanging fruit, and by that I mean beginning really in the 60s and going through really 1990s into the 2000s, with the 90s and the 2000s being kind of the blockbuster period of products. A lot of the easier to treat therapeutic clinical targets have been achieved, and frankly, those drugs the patents have expired, and all of those drugs are now genericized, which does not feed the revenue streams required for an R&D based industry. 90% of all drugs in the United States are written by physicians for generics. So only 10% are branded drugs. It's a similar situation in all of the European Union also. How has the industry addressed this? Well, they've gone in what I refer to as an orphan specialty portfolio business model. Certainly the R&D portfolio is very heavy on that. And what that means is it's no longer low-hanging fruit. It's difficult to treat therapeutic targets, a lot of it oncology, a lot of it immunology, and a host of autoimmune diseases that are very difficult to treat. Right now, 16 of the top 20 selling drugs in 2021 worldwide fall into this orphan specialty portfolio business model. So you're getting the revenue from a decreasing patient population. What does that mean? It means the price is going up. So corporate profitability, cost distortion, and economic unsustainability. By that, what I mean is 75% of the global profit for the pharmaceutical industry comes from the United States. It achieves this not by volume of units sold, but by the cost. In the United States, there is no drugs have unlimited pricing potential, meaning you can launch the drug at any price that you so choose. And you can also increase the cost of the drug whenever you feel like it. What this is really ramped up now is that the average price of the drugs launched and approved by the FDA last year for the median price is in excess of $150,000. I think in a mid-year review in July of this year, looking back 12 months, I think that went up to $257,000 for 30 drugs, which was the bulk of those approved during that 12-month period. Certainly, these are oncology, these are some gene therapies, very, very expensive drugs for a very small patient population. This really cannot continue because over time, you're having such economic distortions in the United States that the percentage of cost for pharmaceuticals relative to the overall healthcare cost in the United States has dramatically increased from 8 to 10% to, in some cases, 20% when everything is fully loaded. And that is similar to what physicians' salaries is, for example. So there will be healthcare reforms. There's no question about it. The U.S. Congress approved and was signed into law a couple of months ago the initial reforms of pharmaceutical pricing. It will impact the ability of companies to increase their price over time, and it will also decrease drugs in a phased fashion. I think it's the 10 highest priced drugs over a period of time in several years going forward. So with a contraction of the U.S. pharmaceutical pricing, you're going to have a change in the overall global pharmaceutical market. One thing that is absolutely for certain is that as these more difficult to treat drugs or therapeutic areas are addressed by drugs, you're going to have to spread the R&D cost over a larger geographic area. So geographic market expansion is going to be absolutely essential to lower and amortize the R&D cost. Let's take a real quick look. This is a little bit of an older slide. It's pre-pandemic, and I'm just showing it to you really to give you an idea of what the overall healthcare expenditure by country and by region is. This is in U.S. dollars. This is the per capita cost each year for each one of these countries, and this is the percentage of the GDP. If you quickly look, the United States, we're running close to $9,000 per capita when I created this slide. Out of that, approximately half of it is government-sponsored healthcare insurance, really for the lower income and for the elderly, and then it's private insurance, which is a very large market in the United States with a little bit of out-of-pocket. A lot of these are in the lighter shade that you see here is out-of-pocket. The red shade is all of the government-sponsored plans. So real quick, the U.S. is outrageous. The OECD average among all of those countries is a little less than $4,000, running about a little less than 8% of GDP. Excuse me, take that back, about 10% of the GDP, as you can see. China, on the other hand, is the overall out-of-pocket in this slide, I believe, is about $700 to $800, and it's looking at about 4% of the GDP. I can go into this a bit more detail so that you can see in a comparison basis for emerging markets. First of all, these are the BRICS and mints, and that's just the abbreviation of these countries. You can see China is a proper comparator in the emerging markets. The countries, GDP per capita, population, total healthcare spend. If you will look at the rankings here in China, China is the #1 in the dollar ranking for the GDP. I've put the purchasing price parity here to the side because that's a little better to compare the healthcare cost, which actually the healthcare cost is usually figured in purchasing price parity. But as you can see, it's #1 in GDP income among all of these countries. Of course, it's #1 in population, still ahead of India, though next year I think India will probably eclipse that, but it's larger than all the other countries, excluding India combined. And however, it is 6th in terms of its total healthcare spending at purchasing price parity. It's about $894 purchasing price parity. That represents only about 4.6% of the total GDP for purchasing price parity, and that's only 5, and that's the 5th out of these rankings. If you look down and compare, for example, with Japan, Japan has roughly, if you're comparing the per capita GDP income, it's about 40% China has about 40% of what Japan does, and it's about 20% of the uh, um, uh, of the purchasing price parity on that. Very, very small percentage of it. As you can see, the multiplier there. And of course, the United States is a little bit outrageous here. We're an outlier for sure, but that gives you an example. China's simply not spending enough money on its healthcare, and they have a problem. This is an old slide. I apologize. These numbers have increased. Japan is, for example, now about 29%. Brazil is up about 10%. China is up, the United States is up 17% of the percentage age population. China is up to 12%. It will be going to 26.8% by 2050. A very rapid ramping of the over 65, which is intensified healthcare expenditure, as everyone knows. The take-home message on this really is that in these Western countries, the per capita expenditure on healthcare is much, much greater than China, but China is going to be facing a similar situation very quickly in terms of its overall healthcare spend. They're actually probably a generation behind in ramping up their healthcare expenditure, and this is really due to almost 2 generations of a one-child policy that China has changed. So the question is with this large opportunity for China is to increase its healthcare expenditure, is it opening up in a manner that, in a way that would be productive to invest either as a multinational coming into China or expanding the footprint in China? Let's take a look and see some of the issues here. First of all, China's healthcare services and pharmaceutical sector. Let me give you a real quick overview of the current status of it. This is a little historic because there has been revolutionary reforms to meet that increasing healthcare demand, and that's what I wanted really to take home. Healthcare services and delivery, there is an imbalance, and this is due to patient perception. And by that, what I mean is healthcare distribution in China, the service delivery is vis-a-vis approximately 10,000 healthcare centers in the more rural areas, 6,000 regional district hospitals in the provincial and the district areas, and 1,400 very large tertiary, what is referred to as Tier 3 and Tier 4 hospitals in the urban areas. The perception of the Chinese patient is, I want to go to the large hospitals because the doctors are better and they'll have access to Western medicine, branded Western medicine, the newest, the best, and the best technology. Therefore, I will leave the province or the rural area, go to the city, and I'll be treated. And you leave a significant imbalance, which is going on here in terms of patient service delivery. China is moving heaven and earth to try to change this, but it is a perceptual problem. And part of this is it has to do with the operating revenue at the province versus the federal level. And that's really where the problem occurs. Physicians really face wage stagnation, low salaries, professional immobility. They cannot move around. The hospitals have a fixed service charge. Therefore, their revenues are limited, and these revenues would not cover operating costs. So how do these hospitals, and even including these large tier hospitals, it's very high volume, how do they pay their bills? They really have now a dependence over time. This is changing, but this is historically the way it was. If you would go to these Tier 3 hospitals, the patient would see the physician. Sometimes the patient would offer a voluntary contribution, or referred to as kind of red letter, just a gratuitous contribution to the physician for treating them properly. That physician would then, which would augment low salaries, that physician would then prescribe drugs, often the Western drugs, which they perceived even as a better quality. Certainly they're a higher price. The hospitals would get as much as 40% of their operating budget from the profits from the pharmaceutical sector. And a lot of the remainder would be made up with high-end services such as CAT scans and MRIs. But there's been tremendous healthcare reforms taking place over the last 5 years. the first thing really that the government attempted to do was to go into the key opinion leader fiefdoms, the department chairs, the hospital administrators, to establish a system of accountability by optimizing and centralizing management, also in purchasing that I'll touch on in a moment. So people have been moved into these tier 3 and T4 hospitals to make dramatic changes, and I'll touch on these in due detail going forward. Pharmaceutical role in healthcare services has undergone extensive reforms. They cover 3 areas: quality of drugs from development through manufacture, control, accountability, and compliance, and of course, purchasing, distribution, price, and patient access. What is the objective of these regulatory reforms for the pharmaceutical industry? It's really to create a Chinese pharmaceutical sector, not simply a manufacturer. What do I mean by that? In the pre-reform pharmaceutical industry, foreign multinational business model really was that drugs that companies wanted to get approved in China would take an excessively long period of time because the existing regulatory agency simply could not review them. They did not have the capacity or capability. It often took years to get a drug approved. Sometimes that was very late in the product life cycle of the drug. Sometimes the drug was already genericized in the West, but they would be approved in China and sold really as the most modern drugs which were available, because in excess of 90% of the quote-unquote innovative drugs were of Western origin. And they were sold by tertiary hospitals, these phase 3 and phase 4 products. That was the way that the pharmaceutical industry, the multinational pharmaceutical industry, sold and distributed their drugs. It was nice. It was profitable. It was minimal risk when you looked in terms of IP. The legacy Chinese pharmaceutical industry really derived out of the chemical industry, and really what it consisted of was chemical copies of Western drugs sold at a discount. These were small molecule chemicals. They did not undergo Western bioequivalence. They were not generics. And so there was the perception that of their lower quality. Quite frankly, they were, because you didn't know if they were bioequivalent. And that was one reason why the tertiary care physicians wanted to prescribe Western drugs. The National Medical Products Administration reformed, which is the equivalent of the Chinese FDA. They have phased priorities. The first priority they've undertaken is in quality. In manufacturing, that is all about compliance. Compliance began in 2010 with the requirement that drug manufacturers in China had to meet CGMP manufacturing requirements. Then in 2016-17, clinical bioequivalence of existing drugs that were being sold by the Chinese legacy companies would have to meet bioequivalence, which means they're going to have to go into these drugs that are already being on the market and undertake bioequivalence studies to maintain them on the market. GXP, good manufacturing practices, clinical practices, laboratory practices, etc. Compliance with the marketing authorization application. So when companies file their marketing authorization applications, the entire package had to be, data package had to be GXP compliance. This was all on paper, but as it began to be slowly enforced over time, this led quickly to a consolidation in the industry. I won't go into details. Is an interesting study, and frankly, it's 25 years worth of regulatory reform in about 5 years has been undertaken by the Chinese government here. In terms of clinical development, it's all about speed. The NMPA moved to approve clinical trial applications. Prior to reform, it would take 18 to 24 months, 60-day review or less. If it's not approved in 60 days, it'll be issued. It will be approved in 60 days. So that rapidly moved the clinical development phase for new drugs. Marketing authorization fast tracks were implemented, and in terms of the time frame for approvals of new marketing applications, it is on parity with Western fast track accelerated approval pathways. Standardization of all documentation. China joined the ICH. They actually became a member of the board a year later, I think about 2017 roughly. And of course, all technical guidance, regulation of newer technologies, et cetera, are all being implemented pretty much on paper out of Beijing. And of course, foreign training for these central reviewers was very much important. But the issue, while all of this about compliance was implemented, and while you had dramatic improvements in terms of the overall speed of review, you've had hundreds of drugs that have been approved over the last 5 years where you would just have hardly any. Compliance really is the Achilles heel of the reform process, and part of this is really due to the fact that the compliance, the inspectors for both clinical trials as well as manufacturing are at the provincial level. You're dealing with the same people that are interfacing with the people at the phase 3 and phase 4 hospitals where most of the clinical trials are run, are the manufacturing facilities. So that is what is really lagging, and it does have an impact in terms of foreign sourcing in clinical trials, because if GXP is not achieved in clinical development or in manufacturing, multinational companies will not want to participate. In terms of additional priorities, pricing and patient access, of course, was a major reforms. You had in excess of 10,000 wholesalers. The distribution channels were very few, were national. It was really just a very fragmented, relatively unregulated distribution system in drugs, and you've had lots of problems, including, for example, vaccines that were heat labile that's occurred recently in childhood. All of this has been changed. Now, the number of wholesalers have been limited that can supply any, for example, tertiary hospitals. Those tertiary hospitals now have a zero markup policy from the distributor. So if you have a limited number of distributors that are supplying a hospital, the government can go back and see what the hospital paid for that drug and also what the markup was. So the profitability of dependence on the pharmaceutical markup is moving away out of the hospital. Two of the biggest reforms are in volume-based procurement and national reimbursement drug lists. Volume-based procurement really is a national tendering of real generics. And again, by that I mean the government at the national level will approach, put out tender bids, and they require that it's based on established bioequivalence for generic quality consistency evaluation. That's the term given for real generics. Bioequivalent generics can participate in the tendering only. And of course, you had multiple rounds, started with oral drugs. It migrated into injectables, and it's now moved into insulins, and ultimately it probably will move into biosimilars as they become more genericized. There are multiple bids have already taken place. They will accept. It's not always just a high bid. I believe 3 or 4, depending on the drug and depending upon the supply, bids will be awarded per drug, not just on the lowest price base. This has completely revolutionized the way that drugs are bought in China. The generic drugs, it has driven the price down dramatically, and it has put a lot of the multinational companies, it's just tore through their existing old portfolios, and they're having to move strictly to innovation, which of course is what the government wants. National reimbursement drug list is for innovative or patented drugs. And this is really a quid pro quo. Here's the deal. We will place you on the National Drug Reimbursement List, which is covered by insurance. And you may get a 5-fold increase in volume if you lower your price. And in the first round, drugs that are willing to do that will usually have to lower their price about 50% of the, for example, the OECD type price. And in the second round, later, after the contract has to be renewed, that will go from 50% to 90%. So it is an eventual lowering of innovative drug price over time. They've had multiple rounds. Over 300 innovative drugs have been approved this way. And this really changes the game for multinational companies. They can no longer get by on selling old branded drugs. because of the volume-based discount. Now they have to move to innovative drugs. And for multinational companies or Western companies that are interested in going into China, this is really the two pathways that you have to capitalize on. This is the rules of the road, so to speak. Of course, there's been expanded insurance coverage for drugs and services, more private insurance, especially in the urban areas. The public rural plan has increased its coverage. It was not quite as generous as was the urban plan. Again, national reimbursement drugs are covered at the national and the provincial level. So you've had dramatic reforms here that have taken place. So what has the regulatory reforms accomplished to date? It's focused global attention on China's pharmaceutical market potential by creating a credible story of China's desire to adopt and follow ICH guidelines for pharmaceutical development, manufacture, and use. In other words, China is going to basically mimic the global pharmaceutical market in terms of its drug development and use. Naturally, international life science venture capital and private equity ecosystem began to form. Money got interested, and they started to support emerging companies and to facilitate optimal exit strategy. China wants to change, the money is going to follow it. As the money began coming in for innovative drugs, sea turtles, which is a term used to sea turtles return back to their place of origin. These are Chinese professionals that were educated often with terminal degrees in the West, many in technical science areas that work for pharmaceutical industries. A lot of them remain Chinese citizens or dual citizens, at least in terms of green cards, for example, in the United States. They returned to China and began forming companies backed by these ventures. Huge, huge expansion. It's outside the scope of my presentation to touch on this, but literally hundreds. This fostered a vibrant R&D based emerging pharmaceutical sector. The IPO market in the STAR market in Shanghai's Bourse, as well as the Hong Kong market exchange, has just dramatically, the IPO market is just phenomenal in there. Again, outside the scope of what I want to touch on, but it's really, really improved the overall environment for Western innovative drugs. Now, the government seeking innovation, that's what they want. They do not want generics, and they want quality. This has forced legacy pharmaceutical companies, which were predominantly chemical companies in their origin, and they did not meet bioequivalence, to develop clinical and R&D based capabilities. So in order to keep their products, their branded drugs, multi-source drugs on the market, the legacy companies had to go back and to undertake bioequivalent studies. This led them down a pathway into doing more R&D, and as they understand, they either get into the innovation or they're going to allow all the small sea turtles as well as the multinationals take it. So the large legacy companies are establishing R&D centers everywhere. In other areas, this has consolidated a fragmented service sourcing and distribution quite dramatically. This is, for example, CMOs, drug distributors, all the service sectors consolidated, and I'll touch on the CMO sector in a moment. So I asked the question, China has a huge, it is the largest single country for opportunity for healthcare expansion, opportunity for growth in the pharmaceutical sector. But were they making the changes to do? Yes, they are. But is it closing? Because there's a lot of risk, and I referred to those risks in my entry, not some of the geopolitical aspects, but there still remains a lot of risk in doing business in China. So let's touch on those. The first one that I'd like to touch on in the current environment is really human resources. While you have a lot of sea turtles that return, and you have a lot of technical capability in China in terms of PhDs educated in the technical fields, there still remains a limited native expertise for a global industry. And by that I mean technical people in China who have had Western experience, that they understand how to operate in a global environment, because for GXP and Chinese companies need to operate at that scale. They're members of ICH, and certainly if they ever want to export, they have to operate at global industry standards. Regulatory and clinical are the two areas that's really lacking the most among Chinese natives. And of course, as everyone understands, there's an increasingly difficult expatriate posting environment to live in China. Travel, because of the pandemic, has been and remains very, very difficult because of the coronavirus situation. As everyone knows, there's been a significant change in terms of the amount of overall surveillance that has been taking place, and there's been sanitization, which is occurring even with government policy, which involves corporate level. It also involves, for example, international schools. This makes especially family expatriate hosting difficult, more and more difficult to achieve. So these two things in terms of human resources are current risk. Corporate and commercial current risk, despite legal reforms, and there's been a number of reforms undertaken, it remains highly problematic environment to ensure protection of intellectual property. The singular most important thing that could be done for multinational companies is to have patent regulatory linkage, where that no company could file for a drug approval on a product that still had and maintained a patent in China, and the regulatory agency would not allow that filing. China has over a number of regulatory changes that have been proposed. I'm not sure what the current status is at the drug administrative law level is right now, but everything that I've seen, that patent linkage has been dropped from that. Also, response times are somewhat ridiculous. So if you are aware that somebody may be impinging your patent, you got to be aware and let the courts know, or let the regulatory authorities involved in the IP patent know very, very quickly. So intellectual property. Of course, as I've already stated, there is a substantial revenue impact of the NRDL on new products. 50% reduction in for example, OECD price in China if you want to get reimbursement for your product. As far as the volume-based purchasing, procurement of branded drugs, Western drugs that you're wanting to sell at a premium price, that's pretty much completely been killed. Very few Western products remain in the volume-based purchasing of generics. Because of the quality increase, almost all of them are domestic. Of course, this is one that is getting increasingly more difficult. There's exchange controls, restricted profit rate repatriation. Companies often would have set up their finance offices in Hong Kong. This has become a lot more problematic in the last couple of years for companies that operated on the mainland in China. This is consideration. And again, as I've stated, increasing centralization of management and limited operational latitude. For example, in Western companies, often you're required to have union members on board of directors if the companies are unionized. In China, it is becoming more and more a requirement to have members of the Chinese Communist Party on your board of directors. And this raises a whole host of concerns in terms of the independence of management of Western companies. And one that has to be taken into consideration. And as far as limited operating options, for example, with a CMO, you simply cannot, if you want to manufacture your drug in China with a CMO, you're restricted in terms of the organization of that CMO. You have to manufacture from drug substance, API, all the way through to drug product. So you just can't just set up phase manufacturing operations. And of course, then you have import and export issues if you're bringing it out of the country for manufacture. Regulatory risks that are still in the current environment: non-transparency or non-access for clinical trial and manufacturing operations by foreign regulatory agencies. This is real simple. What foreign regulatory agencies, they're used to being able to go over and inspect at will, not well in advance notification, but at will, manufacturing sites that are importing drugs into the United States, for example, or the European Union. And non-transparency is in terms of clinical trials, similar situations in terms of if clinical trials are meeting GCP, for example, or if you're dealing with international or IRB boards. So non-transparency and access is always an issue. Regulatory incompatibility, and these two really are linked. To give you an example, for drug development and review and approvals, to give you an example, a PD-1 was developed by a Chinese company, and they sought approval in the United States because of non-transparency and access and other reasons. And that was in terms of comparators, and these are clinical trial reasons. The drug was just not approved by the FDA, and as a matter of fact, it really has put a question mark over all the PD-1 and PD-2s that China has under development for Western markets. And this is an incompatibility in terms of how you develop drugs, what is involved, how do you stage that development. In other words, as companies go into phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, you need to get Western development agencies involved and comfortable with the clinical trial design. Certainly they need to have access to the clinical trial centers for review, and certainly all of this in terms of its manufacturing of the drug's substance for clinical trial, as well as drug substance for the approved product. These are two issues that still exist. Impact of limited enforcement of regulatory compliance. Again, if compliance of the GXP is not what it should be, this is a huge regulatory risk for any Western company that is wanting to operate in China or that is seeking to increase its footprint. The question is whether it is meeting GXP, and certainly the latitude of operating. Can you use a contract manufacturing organization in China? Do they meet the standards, etc.? And there are prohibitive barriers for international clinical trial participation. There's a variety of these. Let me give you one example. If you're undertaking a clinical trial, a multinational global clinical trial, or even a regional clinical trial involving a number of countries with a number of sites in China, oftentimes these are, again, very sophisticated disease targets, often involving novel bio targets and ways to analytically assess the efficacy of the drug. You're not looking at clinical endpoints. And to standardize the evaluation of the results of the clinical trials, or the samples of clinical trials, you'll have maybe one or maybe two labs around the world, takes all the samples and looks at these biomarkers in detail, because it's all exploratory at this stage. You cannot do that with China. China will not let you ship drug samples if they involve human DNA. Of course, they're going to, out of the country. So this is just one of the issues that companies need to consider and are going to have to work with. When it was in Hong Kong, that was a little different. You could set up operations in Hong Kong. It's problematic whether that's going to be you're going to be able to do that now. It's just something for consideration. And of course, fast track approval provisions, limited manufacturing sourcing options for CMOs. Again, as I mentioned, with the CMOs in China, it's whether the drug is manufactured in China, whether it is manufactured abroad, whether it is a multinational company, whether it's a domestic company. If it's in China, it must go from API all the way through drug substance all the way to drug product. There's a whole host of issues as it relates to getting fast track approval, regulatory approval pathway in terms of the sourcing. So this is one that has to be ganned out and charted, printed out real good. Geopolitical situation. Again, this really began in mid 2017, and it's over the last 5 years, it has continued. It's only gotten worse, even with the most recent Bali G20 conference. I don't, from what's come out of that, I don't think it's really changed anybody's attitude too much. There is a restriction on licensing and our technology transfer. CFIUS in the United States, which reviews foreign intellectual property. The EU, while they do not have something similar to this at the EU level in Brussels, each country looks at it. And what this involves is that US-made technology has to be approved before it can be sold or transferred to China. Same case in Europe. We know the situation around microchips right now. In Europe, week before last, you saw where the new chancellor of Germany, who used to be the mayor of Hamburg, kind of overruled his own party, and the cabinet ruled against the recommendations of them and allowed the sale to go through of 25% of the ports in Hamburg to Costco, which is a Chinese company, even though they reduced it from 35% to 25%. So there's a whole list of issues that's coming out of this. And I must say that the Department of Commerce has already stated informally there are going to be other technologies besides microchip included in this, and biopharmaceuticals, life sciences is more than likely going to be some of those that are going to be included. Again, remember, this goes back to the 10 technologies, high technologies that were targeted and made in China 2025. And of course, life sciences and the biopharmaceutical sector are part of those. So this may increase. Reshoring of supply chains. With the pandemic, it became evident to the entire West that much of our medical supplies, especially disposables, for example, some equipment, but certainly the supply chains for those equipments, and to a lesser extent, drugs were manufactured in China. And with a global pandemic, this shined a spotlight on it dramatically. And governments both in the United States and Europe swore that they were going to reshore strategic supply chains back to their countries. Pharmaceuticals are at the top of that list. So the reshoring of supply chains is a condition you have to consider on that. And of course, with this environment going on, and with opinion polls, for example, with Pew, both in the United States and Europe over time, because of the pandemic, because of the environment that we're currently in as it relates to the trade war, etc., foreign direct investment and capital going into China is really under circumspect, especially by boards of directors. Future environment for political risk. Well, as I mentioned, further restrictions on licensing and technology transfer. The U.S. Department of Commerce is more than likely going to include more technologies, and biopharmaceuticals and life sciences more than likely will be included in that in the future. At least that is what is going forward, especially as if the reshoring of the supply chains take place. Now, right now, the reshoring of the supply chains as it relates to pharmaceuticals and medical products have been a gentleman's agreement among some companies with governments, but that could easily be increased to mandatory. For example, all that has to happen in the United States is the federal government say, we're no longer going to purchase pharmaceuticals or medical supply products for the military or for Veterans Affairs, which are, of course, retired military, unless they ensure that the supply chains are from the United States or from a list of allied countries, for example, or nearshoring as opposed to farshoring. This could also be done with government insurances for the elderly, for government insurance for the lower income in the case of the United States, or government insurances, healthcare insurances in general in Europe. So all of these could take place. You could have a generalized decoupling between China and the West that has been advocated. Again, these are talking heads Within governments, you've got differences of opinion. Wall Street, manufacturers, the commercial side, chambers of commerce say it's impossible to decouple from China. Government policymakers are saying you're going to decouple from China, certainly as it relates to strategic supply. So where this ends up, we don't know. Again, there could be punitive tariffs, if things were to deteriorate, and certainly, I mean, it could even go as far as sanctions. So these are considerations that one has to consider if you are expanding your footprint in China, or certainly if you're wanting to come to China as a pharmaceutical or a life science company. So in summary, single greatest generational opportunity for global pharma. Is that correct? Is that statement that I've used many times correct, or is it not correct? Let's take a look, summarize what we have. The R&D-based global pharma industry's U.S. price-based revenue model will be reformed. It's already undertaken. An industry must geographically expand sales to amortize the cost of their specialty portfolio. Now, will they go beyond a specialty portfolio? No, because again, the easy targets have all been reached. You're going into more difficult to treat. The science is usually higher. Everything's more expensive. Endpoints are harder to achieve. So you're looking at very expensive drugs. And again, despite what many doubting Thomases, as we say in the Christian tradition, that whether or not that the U.S. pricing model is going to change, it is changing. It has officially changed as of about 8 weeks ago in the United States, and it's only going to get more. For example, let me explain real quick. While with the current legislation that's been signed into law in the United States will restrict will limit increases, annual increases in products that have been approved, and they'll reduce the prices of a certain number of drugs each year will be added to the pool that must be reduced by. There's a variety of metrics here. It doesn't say a thing about launch pricing. Launch pricing is not addressed. I assure you that the United States will be moving toward like the rest of the world, to some type of a cost-benefit analysis. We have ICER, which is really kind of like the UK's NICE, which is a cost-benefit organization that reviews the price of the drug relative to the overall benefit of the patient. They do it in an economic terms. Our lawyers over here argue on whether that's valid. You have to have some kind of basis when you're looking at these more and more expensive drugs. And what that means is that if drugs are marginal, they're going to be discontinued. You're going to have real therapeutic value to get drugs approved. That's going to require geographic expansion. China must increase patient access and invest more in healthcare as the population rapidly ages. As I've demonstrated, China represents the singular largest global market opportunity in a generation. It's much more an opportunity than India, and the basis of that is the per capita expenditure that China can bear on it right now. Of course, India has a large population. They simply have not been able to allocate the monies to treat that. So in the future, India will represent a huge market, but at the moment, it's not. China, for the foreseeable future, will be that market. China is reforming its healthcare services and pharmaceutical regulations to meet this demand. We've seen how those revolutionary reforms have taken place. And China's pharmaceutical market will develop and expand as the patient demand, regardless of geographic risk. So based upon that summary, my recommendation is yes. But these are ways to optimize that. Go native and look at it in terms of the long haul. Focus Chinese operations for China in China. Do not expand your footprint in China if you're already there, or invest in China for thinking you're going to have an export base. For China in China. It's a huge market. Plan on independence from your parent or affiliates. And by that I mean, do not launch your product and assume that you're going to have the R&D portfolio of your parent companies or your affiliate companies in the West feeding you novel and innovative products, there could be technology transfer issues related to that. There could be, tariffs related with that. God help, there could be embargoes related to that, or sanctions, I should say. Plan on independence from your parent affiliates. Quality is always king. This is not just to China, it's to anyone, not the price, especially as you're talking about very expensive products. It's not the price of that 1 gram of Humira, the manufacturing price. It's what you sell that for. Quality is always king. Incorporate GXP in all operations and have complete transparency from clinical trials, laboratories, manufacturing. Invest in people and retain them. Not in machinery. Of course, you have to have machinery, and pharmaceutical equipment is very expensive, and you need to have what you can meet the GXPs, but it's your people. There is a very long learning curve. These are high technology people. Invest and retain them. Innovate for the China market. If you're developing drugs, target China first. Certainly if it's novel technologies, anything else is a bonus. It could be out licensed, but just assume it is the China market. Be a participant in China's basic research and focus on deliverables, not on IPO flipping. Companies need to establish relationships with academic institutions, with research institutions, with incubators that are part of institutions or even independent. Work with them hand and glove to develop technologies and to bring forth drugs that are deliverable, not creating a company on paper with a clinical trial application with the NMPA and then go and worry about flipping that IPO on the Hong Kong or the Shanghai bourse. That's not the objective. Develop deliverables. This is also true for the West as it is in China. Companies need to focus on deliverables, not on financial instruments for short-term gain. Actively pursue market on a global basis, which are market appropriate, meaning in-license drugs into China anywhere in the world which are appropriate for the Chinese market, if you can. So you have your feelers out and license drug in. There may be, for example, drugs that are cast off from clinical development in the United States or in Europe because they're no longer economically feasible for those markets. Because the patient population is so small, the efficacy gain is not appropriate within a cost-benefit setting. China could license those. But always remember, pharmaceuticals might be a market to the industry, but it is healthcare to the Chinese people, and the government will always remember that. Again, I hope that my little presentation here today and my conversation has assisted you and helped you, and I just want to thank you, and I hope that this was informative, and I hope you have a good time at the CPHI.